In this video, we will be replacing both the passenger and driver side valve cover gaskets in this 2012 Ford F150. Taking a look inside the engine, we first want to remove our engine appearance cover. To do this, we need to remove the oil fill cap, work that engine cover off, and slide it out. We can then reinstall that cap so we don't get any debris falling down that location. And taking a look on the passenger side, we can definitely see some oozing of our seals. This is why we are performing this repair. Our air cleaner outlet pipe is our Y pipe coming off of our air box. This is the next part that we need to remove, and this is held on by 3 worm clamps. The book then calls for removal of the right-hand air cleaner pipe to turbocharger pipe. Because this goes down to the turbocharger, it would be difficult to remove, so we're going to attempt to do this with just pivoting this out of the way a little bit to give us the access that we need. It then wants us to remove the right-hand turbocharger to charge air cooler tube. This one is also going to the turbocharger and would be difficult to remove without removing the tire and wheel well to gain access to that. We do, however, have a bracket that we will be attempting to remove, but as far as these 2 tubes, we're just going to try to pull them out of the way. And periodically we will be cleaning off the engine components with compressed air to reduce the chance of debris falling into areas where we do not want it. At this point, we will be removing the PCV tube. Both sides have connectors that need to be retracted back, and then we can wiggle that off. We then want to remove the 2 nuts from the charge air cooler tube bracket. This is the bracket that is connected to the valve cover. These are 8mm fasteners, and we will be applying a little bit of Amsoil metal protector to help remove these a little bit easier. And those fasteners were 2 tiny 8mm nuts. And we can then work off that bracket. And for the time being, we'll leave that bracket there and see if we can work around it. Now we do have a coolant line that we also need to work off. We then have a bundle of 3 tubes. The first of which is going to our turbocharger waste gate. We can then pull that hose off of the waste gate. And those additional lines, I do have some flexibility on those. We'll then shift focus to our PCM electrical connector. This has a small tab on the side that needs to be depressed. And then we do have a second electrical connector. And if we follow that bundle of wires towards the back of the valve cover, we do have a retainer. We can then take a look at our right-hand VCT solenoid electrical connectors. This is the area that the valve cover was leaking from, and we have a small tab that needs to be pushed up, and then we can wiggle off that connector. And it is worth noting we have a light and a dark connector. And then we can work our coil pack wiring harnesses off. And a little bit more compressed air. And those coil pack fasteners are 8mm. And for the time being, we will stick a rag down those locations. So at this point, I have disconnected a bunch of my stuff. I'm going to take a close look around the outside edge of my valve cover, and I'm going to disconnect each of the locations where there is a wire tie holding some type of wire or tubing onto those valve cover bolts. And it almost seems like they have something on every single bolt. Now I am very carefully cutting all of these clips, and you may be asking, why is he cutting all the clips? And what I'm going to do for reassembly is pull out the existing piece, and we're going to feed our own zip tie underneath that, and that will allow us to re-zip tie all of these components back together without damaging the clips that are actually held into the engine. And this one on the top right corner does unscrew, and then we can work that plastic retaining clip off. And again, any wiring harness or connector that is in the way, if I can move that out of the way a little bit, it will give me a little more room to work. And at this point, I think I have loosened and removed as much as I can around the outside of the valve cover. I'm going to go through and apply some Amsoil metal protector to each of these bolts. This will reduce the chance of one of them breaking as I remove it, and I can then work my way around removing each of these bolts. I am going to jump around a little bit as opposed to going in a circle. And our retaining nuts for any of these brackets are 8mm, but the valve cover bolts themselves are 10mm. And there's always got to be one bolt that is near impossible to remove. This one is the lowest most bolt, closest to the firewall on the passenger side. In total, I loosened 11 fasteners around the perimeter of the valve cover. Now, to be honest with you, removing the valve cover is an extremely difficult process. I tried using trim removal tools, but at the end of the day, I had to end up using metal pry bars and basically force it up. I was worried I would break it with the amount of force that I was having to put on it to get that to pop off of there. So after about an hour of working at this, I have been able to get this loose. And I did cut out the majority of my struggle to make it look like it was super easy. And with that removed, a couple things I want to point out. These fasteners do not come out completely. They just loosen up and sit there. Additionally, there was a piece of insulative adhesive that ran a portion of the way around the outside. This was causing me problems. Additionally, each location where either our spark plug goes through or our VCT sensors go, those rubber boots were stuck onto those components, and so it was on there really good. And probably the most difficult piece was the very back center. They did have a wiring harness hooked to this, and it was basically impossible to remove that or pull that off of that retaining location. I did obviously get that off, but it was pretty much a nightmare. Inside the engine, I can do a quick visual inspection just to make sure there's no obvious issues. I do have two locations that I will make sure to add a little extra RTV sealant when I reassemble this. And although this is not in horrible condition, I will use Amsoil's engine degreaser to clean this up. To replace our seals, we're going to wad a towel up inside of there. And we're going to see if we can tap that out with a 21mm socket. And that one did come out. And I'll put my new seals in the same way. I am jumping up to a 1-inch impact socket just because that diameter is slightly larger. And my goal is to get that where we are pretty much flush with the top of that valve cover. And Ford does make a specialty tool for this, but I didn't feel like spending $400 for the kit. So we are doing this a little bit more methodically with the socket. And spark plug locations are done the same way. This time I am starting with the 1-inch socket. And that one didn't work that great, so I am jumping up to a 1 1/4. And that one did work much better. And then our new seals can go in. And I am periodically checking the bottom side just to make sure that they're getting seated properly. And again, this is just a nice methodical process. And we then have our valve cover gasket. With the old gasket removed, we can clean anywhere that needs to be cleaned, and then go ahead and install our new valve cover gasket. We do want to make sure it gets seated in the groove and that the shape of the gasket actually matches the shape of the valve cover. We then have our gaskets or grommets for our fasteners. We can work those fasteners out, and you could cut these off with a utility knife, or you could work those off with a screwdriver. Our new ones can then be slid right over the top of that back into the original location, and these can be reinstalled, and there are little protrusions that will help hold those in place. With all of our new gaskets installed on our valve cover, we want to clean the mating surface with acetone and a scraper if needed. At this point, we should be ready to put this back together. We do want to put a small amount of sealant on our seam for our timing chain cover, 2 locations for that, and then we can work that valve cover back on. And I am adding just a little bit of motor oil to those seals, so it'll hopefully slide on there just a little bit easier. Double check that our gasket has seated properly. And the installation of this actually went fairly decently. You do want to just make sure none of your wiring harnesses get caught underneath there as you're trying to install this. Take your time, and it should go pretty decently. And these valve cover bolts, we will start by hand and snug them down. They will eventually get tightened to 89 inch-pounds. And it is worth noting that you want the VCT seals slightly lower than the top edge of that sensor to help prevent leaks. And before torquing these bolts, you do want to be cognizant of the RTV sealant directions, as some of them require a specified amount of time before you torque it down. And as you do this, you also want to follow the torque sequence. We are torquing these to 89 inch-pounds, but we want to evenly apply pressure to this valve cover as we torque it down, thus the torque specification pattern. At this point, with all of these bolts torqued down, we should be able to work around the perimeter of our valve cover and reconnect any of the lines or other brackets that we took off. And we can use our zip tie hack to reconnect those lines to the existing retainers. And additional electrical wiring harnesses that we previously removed, we want to get those reattached. And again, working around the perimeter just to make sure all the brackets are back on, all our wiring harnesses are secure, and looking for any loose lines that we may have forgot. And then we can replace our ignition coils and any other wiring harnesses. And 62 inch-pounds for those coil over plug fasteners. And don't forget to reconnect the wiring harnesses. The PCV tube is the last component on the passenger side, and then we can jump over to the driver's side and begin work there. And over on the driver's side, we will begin by removing our piece of insulation covering our pump. One of the items we will be removing is the fuel injection pump. And before we remove this, we do want to relieve the fuel pressure. And up underneath the bed above the spare tire, we have the fuel pump control module. This is located towards the front of the spare tire on top of it. Taking a look around the spare tire, we can see our wiring harness. And as we continue to go around that spare tire, we do see that wiring harness connection point for our module. And on the top of the wiring harness, we do have a small tab that we need to depress. This will allow us to wiggle that wiring harness off. We then want to start the engine and let it idle until it dies. Once it dies, we're going to turn over the engine for an additional 5 seconds. Following our fuel line, we do have two 8mm fasteners. We can then put a rag underneath that hard line going to our pump. And before starting to work on the pump, we do want to disconnect the negative battery terminal and set that out of the way.
And to remove the hard line, we are using a 17mm tubing wrench. This is a flared fitting on this fuel line, and so we can work that loose and then pull that off. There will be some residual fuel that leaks out, which is why we have that rag there.
We do want to make note of our electrical connector. The tab is on the bottom, so we will wait until we pull the pump out to get better access. So we will focus on our quick release next.
And these particular quick release clips are not super quick. Perhaps if I have done a bunch of these before, I'd be a little bit quicker. This did take me about 5 minutes to work those tabs through. I was attempting to be very careful so that I did not break the clips or the legs of the clips off, but it will slide out a fair amount. It won't slide all the way out. It will release from that fuel line, and then that will allow us to wiggle the entire connector off of that fuel line. And much like the other line, there will be some residual fuel.
If we take a look at the pump, we have a 10mm fastener on each side. We want to slowly release this, so we're going to be working back and forth between bolts. And we can then work on releasing that wiring harness. We can then disconnect the wiring harness for our ignition coils and remove that fastener. It is an 8mm. And I did see some debris, so I am going to blow this off again with some compressed air before I remove those. And then we can pull those out. And to get my frontmost coil out, I do need to remove that ventilation tube. And there's a little tab to slide to the side. And when I did remove that, I did have this little piece break off. But upon further inspection, it is actually just glued on. So we'll have to do some cleanup and re-glue this. And we can then work on the rest of those coils. And I will add a rag into those holes to help prevent debris from falling down there. We can then remove our VCT sensor harness. We have a little tab that needs to be slid upward, and then we can work that off. And we will want to remove the dipstick as well. At this point, we basically want to work our way around the perimeter of the valve cover. Any point which it is zip tied down to one of the fasteners, or if there is some other component that is in our way, tubes or vacuum hoses or whatnot, we want to move these out of the way as best as we can. And we do have a handful of these wiring harnesses that are held down by these small caps. We can cut those, pull out our tails, trim off the excess, and add new tails. At this point, we have basically removed everything from the perimeter of the valve cover. Our goal now is to loosen the valve cover bolts that go around that perimeter. These bolts do not come all the way out, they just loosen up and spin. And to reduce problems, I will be applying some Amsoil metal protector to each of these fastener locations. These are 10mm fasteners. And I am going to jump around a little bit as I loosen them.
And the hardest part of this job is actually getting the valve cover off. I do not typically recommend people ever using metal pry bars on these type of mating surfaces. However, that was really the only way I was able to get this pried loose, was to put a tremendous amount of force on that to get that to pop off.
And we can do a quick inspection of the inside there. Now this was very difficult to remove. It did probably take an hour or so. Part of the problem was the VCT solenoids will stick in the boots. Additionally, our 3 spark plug locations will stick in those as well. And that's not to mention that the gasket going around the perimeter will also stick. And so we will start prepping this with using Amsoil engine degreaser to clean this up a little bit. And while that valve cover is sitting, we will use some acetone to clean up our mating surface. And I do want to make note of our 2 locations where the timing chain cover mounts to the rest of the engine. These will need some sealant. After we've got that cleaned up, I'm going to be using a 15/16 socket to work out our VCT gasket. And I am going to wedge a towel up underneath it and have this sit on the towel to take some of the shock. And we want to clean that location. And we can install our new seals. And I did jump up to a 1-inch socket for that one. And our spark plug locations can come next. I am using a 1 1/4 inch socket for this. And a little bit of cleanup.
And we can then go through the process of reinstalling our new gaskets for our spark plug locations.
Next we have the gasket for our pump. This is a T30. Now it is worth noting we have a small tab on the gasket that does correlate to a small notched out portion on our valve cover. And we do want to do a bit of cleanup with some acetone. And I am going to clean that groove with a shop towel and then work that new gasket in place. And then I have 2 small O-rings to replace. And that can then be reinstalled. We can then remove our old gasket and work our new gasket in place. Now that we are ready to reinstall everything, we are going to apply a little bit of sealant on the two locations where there is a seam between the engine and the timing chain cover. And we can start our process to work that valve cover back in place. We do want to be a little bit careful that we do not dislodge that new gasket we put on. And right before setting that on, I am going to put a little bit of oil around those new seals so they slide on a little easier.
And as we work this into place, we do want to make sure none of our wiring harnesses are caught underneath the valve cover.
And then we want to start each of those bolts by hand. These are 10mm fasteners. And with those bolts hand tight, we can come back and torque them in sequence to 89 inch-pounds.
And following that torque sequence, we'll ensure we apply even pressure as we install this.
And it is worth noting that the VCT sensors should have the boot sitting just slightly below the top edge of that sensor. If everything went together well, it should slide down just a little bit. And we are at the point where we can start connecting everything back together. I will work my way around the perimeter and make sure that each of the various components get reattached to the corresponding bolt. I had taken some pictures beforehand just to make sure that I get everything reconnected. This includes those VCT sensors. We do have a lighter colored one and a darker colored one.
Because the pump is actuated by the camshaft, we do need to turn the engine over using a 18mm socket on a ratchet. I can rotate the crankshaft pulley in a clockwise direction to turn that engine over and get that moving. And if I speed up the footage, we can clearly see that moving. This will give us a little extra space for installing that pump.
And a couple more items before we install that pump. We'll go ahead and reinstall that dipstick. Followed by our coils. And those get torqued to 62 inch-pounds with an 8mm socket. And then our connectors. And we got that PCV tube. And we can install our pump. And these will be torqued to 89 inch-pounds plus 45 degrees, and we are going to alternate back and forth as we do this. So we got our 89 inch-pounds. Now we're going to go 45 degrees. Then we have our fuel lines and our electrical connector. And we can't forget about those fasteners on that fuel hard line. And then we have our insulation. And before I install that Y pipe for my air system, I am going to do one last visual inspection just to make sure everything is hooked up and I have no loose lines anywhere.
And that Y pipe for our air intake system can then be reinstalled with our 3 worm clamps.
And we can hook up our battery. And don't forget that module up above the spare tire.
And I am going to let this sit for 24 hours before attempting to start it, because we did add sealant to those 2 locations. And when we put the key in, it should activate that fuel pump. And I do like to listen to it to make sure it sounds good, and look at it to make sure oil and gas isn't spewing all over the place.
And then we have our engine cover.
And this repair is complete.